I'm JJ Perez with Inside Runner Sports. Greg Luca, San Antonio Express News, here to wrap up UTSA's 34-14 win over Rice on Saturday night at the Alamo Dome. Greg, the Roadrunners improved to 7-3 overall, win their sixth consecutive game, and look pretty dominant in how they did it. It was kind of a slow start by both teams, but a strong third quarter kind of just propelled the Roadrunners to the win.
Yeah, I thought the defensive effort was pretty impressive, although you have to acknowledge that Rice is without their starting quarterback, JT Daniels, and I think that changes things pretty substantially for them. But still, in 10 drives to force, I think it was 8 punts and a fumble and just give up the one touchdown on the quick drive before halftime, I think changes the complexion of what the defense did a little bit, just that one drive. But other than that, it was a pretty clean showing start to finish. And they created a lot of pressure on the quarterbacks the way they have been. I think they finished with 6 sacks in this one and 10 tackles for loss. And Trey Moore had two more, and I was up to 14, I think it is. So kind of just extending his school record season. And generally, yeah, it was a really strong showing for the defense offensively. Maybe a little bit of a slow start, but they could lean on that running game the way they have been. And I think that we saw a little bit of a spark there in the third quarter. Partially that was a punt return from Chris Carpenter for 50-yard touchdown as well. But generally, I think it was a pretty strong showing all the way around. You can't really complain about a 20-point win, especially when it seemed like most of the starters were sitting through the fourth quarter. So it wasn't even like they had to really go all out to try to get it.
Yeah, the game was, I think, out of the balance late in the third quarter there, and yeah, I mean, just what do you think happened in that first half? Kind of a tale of two halves. Again, second game in a row, the Roadrunners have had one strong half and one kind of weak half, and what do you think that is?
I'm really not sure. I would think that generally this team would be pretty strong out of the gate. I mean, we've
Yep.
seen through Trailer's tenure that they make really strong halftime adjustments, whether it's been games where we ended up talking about different kind of motivational speeches that might have come into play and sparked something, or just generally the schematic adjustments to have a better grasp of things and be able to make on both sides of the ball to make an impact in the second half. So it would be weird if they started slow, given that they had, I think it was 4 straight games before this with an opening
Yeah.
drive
Right.
touchdown.
Yeah.
And I don't really know. I mean, I guess sometimes it was only five. They had 250 yards in the first half.
Right. And he
And
just
Coach Trailer after
couldn't
the
get in the
game,
end zone.
yeah, Coach Trailer after the game said he felt like they were playing well and just not getting rewarded for it offensively. So from that perspective, I could see that a little bit. I know they punted twice. They had to settle for a field goal once. They had the one touchdown, and then Oscar Cardenas had the fumble inside the 10-yard line. And if he ends up rumbling into the end zone instead of fumbling there, I think we probably feel differently about it. To have 17 points and 250 yards in the half probably feels pretty good. Or even if they were up 10-0, if they hadn't given up that one touchdown drive. I just think probably just the way the score played out framed what was probably a pretty good offensive effort. I don't know. Did you see anything that might have led to a slow start, or how did you feel about that part of it?
I don't know what that was. It's just the whole game felt clunky in the first half, and I guess we could talk about the Willie McCoy injury here because that was a part of it too. A real scary situation where he suffered what looked like a neck injury, and I think he's going to end up being okay. But he was down on the field, I think, for more than 10 minutes there, and that kind of led to more lack of flow. I felt like in that first half.
Yeah, that was obviously a pretty scary, unfortunate situation there with Willie McCoy taking the hit, coming across on the slant pattern. And you could tell right away that it might have been something serious. You always hope for the best in those situations. And it did take a long time for them to, I mean, I don't know how many times I've seen a guy get kind of taken out of his jersey and shoulder pads on the field. That's kind of a scary situation to see as well. But it did seem like after the game, based on everything that Coach Trailer said and the statement that UTSA was able to release, even before the game was over, that he seems like he's doing pretty well. And I don't know. I don't want to talk about like a return to the field. I don't know what the situation for that is, but at least that he's healthy and fully responsive and had full mobility and all those things that you worry about. So seems like it turned out a lot better than it could have.
Yeah, I think I counted at 1.7 medical personnel working on him at once. So it was super scary. Greg, I want to jump to the defensive effort. I think we saw one bad drive right before halftime, and then a second drive that wasn't really paying attention to at the very end of the game. Other than that, this defense was lights out again. What's led to this change? Is it just the turnovers and being able to put pressure, like winning in the trenches? I think that's where it starts.
Yeah, I think generally the pass rush has been pretty critical. We obviously
Yeah.
know what Trey Moore brings to the table, but they have so many guys up there between the 9-person rotation on the defensive line, the development we've seen from Jamoya Robinson this season, and even Danye Taylor out of that kind of nickel linebacker kind of hybrid position that they play, creating some disruption. I think he had a sack in this game as well. And it just seems like generally the amount of battles that they're able to win up front allows them to play a little bit more coverage. So, if your three defensive linemen and your linebackers hold up in the run game just fine, and if you can create pressure with that group as well, then you can play, at least man to man, if not with some extra help over the top. So they are not having to sell out to try to create that pressure. And I think that allows them to just be more sound. It's just been harder for teams to put together extended drives against them. And they haven't given up a ton of big plays either, to my recollection. I know that I think last season we talked about that a decent amount,
Yeah.
that they were pretty susceptible to that. And it doesn't seem like this year that they're having that same issue. So maybe it's a product of having to commit less to the pass rush to be able to have that level of pressure, or if it's just a matter of just playing better. I mean, they have a lot of really experienced guys in that group who have done it at a high level for a while. And I think we're just kind of seeing the dividends of that now.
I don't know that I don't know that this defense leads any categories and that they're at the top of any statistical categories, but I don't know that I expected them to be this good at this point of the season.
It's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we saw out of the gate, it seemed like this could be the first year that UTSA's defense was actually the primary driving factor in their success over the offense. The group had been so strong against Houston and against Texas State, and then they hit some lulls, whether it was even against Temple, giving up the amount of yards that they gave
Right.
up. The Tennessee was always going to be a challenge, but there were different times where even as the wins started to come in, I mean, Army is sort of a different beast, but then even as they started to win games, there were some questions about how strong that unit was and
Yep.
what level they could play at. And I mean, even as recently as last week, I think there were probably some people who in the second half were wondering what was going on with the
Yeah.
defensive unit to give up the kind of progress that they did. But I would say more often than not, they've been really strong. And I think every time we talk to a defensive player, I'm trying to probe at, what are the differences you see between the games where it's going well and the games where it's not, or the drives where it's going well and the drives where it's not. And I don't really feel like I've learned too much from asking that as many times as I have. I just think that the answers we get are always just about, assignments and everybody doing their 111th and all the stuff that you would expect. I don't know that there's something where they would even say that the energy is different or that the
Right.
focus is different. I mean, I think all of that probably comes into play, but I think a lot of it comes down to matchups too. In the games that we've seen them do really well, they've been able to limit running attacks at a pretty high
Yeah.
level.
Yeah.
And so I think it just depends what kind of offense you're up against as well, where if that's something that neutralizing that then kind of sends ripple effects to the rest of the group, then maybe that's where they're having that success from. And maybe it'll be matchup dependent, or maybe they've just kind of turned a corner and it's going to be like what we saw when they flashed early in the season.
UTSA's offense has another strong effort on the ground, rushing for 199 yards. Pretty hefty yards per carry average without starting running back Kavorian Barnes, who was sidelined with an injury. Coach Trader said afterwards, Kavorian may have been able to go, but they were being cautious with him. Greg, this rushing game seems like it's hitting on all cylinders at this point in the
Yeah,
season, doesn't it?
we've talked pretty significantly about the strength of their three running backs and what those guys all bring to the table. And part of the reason we talk about that is because then when you have a situation like this, you see that they're just fine playing with two.
Yeah.
Rocco Griffin gets 12 rushes for 81 yards and a touchdown. And there might have been, he had a week where he sat out for precautionary reasons and then has looked faster and faster as he's gotten back into the fold and started to play at a higher and higher level. And then Robert Henry is maybe not stealing the show as much as he was earlier in the year, but he still seems like it's a real chore to try to tackle him if you're the defense
Yeah.
and it's just not a fun assignment when he gets the ball. And he ended up with 19 carries for 63 yards and a touchdown. So cumulatively, I think the group had, it looks like 199 yards. And I think you take out the sacks and they were probably over 200. So generally, it seems like that's something that UTSA can lean on. And whether it's a product of the receiver room being what it is, or if it's just something about matchups, the passing game hasn't necessarily had to carry this offense the same way it seems like it has in years past. Not to say the run game was ever bad. There's been plenty of productive seasons there, but it did seem like this was a pass first, offense first team. And now there's times where, like we said, it feels like a defense first or run first team where the passing is like the fourth or fifth most important component. So I think it's probably a promising sign for any Roadrunners fans that this team can win in a lot of different ways.
What was your takeaway of the offensive line play? It seemed like they struggled last week at North Texas and may have bounced back a little this week.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is also just going to come down to matchups, how
Yeah.
strong are the players that you're going up against. And generally, it seems like this group is starting to solidify. It's funny because after the first few weeks of shuffles, I remember we did one of these videos and I said, I think we'll probably see more shuffling through the year, but it'll be just to optimize. Like maybe when a guy like Mekhi Hart returns, or if one of those, whether it was Buffalo Cruz or whoever from the JUCO transfer group got healthy and earned a spot, or continued moving people around on the interior as a result of that. But it just kind of has solidified into the group that they've run the last few weeks. We saw Payne Abear take about a half of snaps last week because Terrell Haynes was suspended. But other than that, about 5 or 6 weeks in a row, it's been the same offensive line group. And it doesn't mean the production's gotten better and better and better. Like you mentioned, there were some red flags last week against North Texas, but generally I think that the consistency level is only going to go up as those guys get used to each other, especially because you have a new center in Luke Lopez who hasn't really made those calls before or played at this level. And it's just something that chemistry has to build as well. So I think you should see better and more consistent performances through the year. And at this point, it seems like this is just the group that they're going to have, and that's probably fine.
The last thing I want to touch on in the actual game today, from this week, is the punt return for a touchdown. Obviously, I think that was one of the turning points in the game. UTSA might have still blown this team out, but that was part of that 21-point third quarter where Chris Carpenter recorded the third ever punt return for a touchdown in UTSA history. Um, yeah, it just, again, another all three phases of the football working for the Roadrunners this week, Greg.
It's a really interesting scenario for Chris Carpenter in particular because he had the fumble against North Texas
Yeah,
that UTSA got back, and then he had the fumble yesterday that I think the Roadrunners jumped on that one too,
right.
right?
Yeah.
But in two fumbles in 2 weeks, I think a lot of people were probably clamoring for, and I think I started to be on the lookout for, is there going to be a different option back there at returner? And we asked Jeff Traylor about this after the game, and he said, obviously, with Willie McCoy being injured, that the number two option was out of the picture too. But how many guys do we see fielding punts on a week,
Yeah.
like in warmups and whatnot? They have other guys they can turn to there if they really wanted to, and they chose to stick with Carpenter, and he rewarded them for that. So I think that's pretty cool, especially because Willie McCoy came in and took over the kickoff duties, which had been Carpenter, and he had the long touchdown last season, the first touchdown on a kick return ever for the Roadrunners. And so his special teams role was cut in half in that sense, seeing his seeing his kick return got taken over. And then I know when we talked to him before the season, if I remember correctly, he said it was a big goal of his to be a starting wide receiver this year, and that hasn't materialized for him. He's been sort of passed on the depth chart by the freshman Devin McEwen and maybe even David Amador, just depending on what the snap counts look like week to week or what you're seeing. And so for him to maybe not hit some of the marks he wanted to this year and to seem like his role is decreasing through the season, and then to be able to come through with a moment like that is really cool. It had to be pretty fulfilling for him and for the coaches who chose to give him another opportunity even after the fumbles.
The Roadrunners have won 6 straight games. They're tied for first place in the American Athletic Conference standings with Tulane and SMU. It looks like it's coming down. It's going to be coming down to that last game in 2 weeks at Tulane for the Roadrunners. They control their own destiny. I enjoyed your angle in your story last night about how it seems like Coach Traylor's enjoying this ride a little bit more than the previous two, which were more successful, it seems like, right?
Well, I don't know. I think you could argue that it's easy to look back and forget how the last two seasons really materialized, where how often were we talking about like one play away
Right.
from some
Yeah.
games being losses and it changing the whole course of the season? There was probably 3 or 4 games where one play could have swung it, and they just found a way to get it done. I don't know that you could point to any game this year and say they were 1 or 2 plays away from
Yeah.
losing. I mean, North Texas ended up being an 8-point game, but North Texas really had to sort of rally to make that happen. And I guess it was tense, but I don't know, the way the first half played out, it felt like UTSA was in control and was going to find a way to get it done eventually. So generally speaking, I think it's a more dominant conference run, but the team isn't getting credit for being as strong as the teams of the past couple of years because of the way the non-conference season played out. And that's probably deserved. I don't know if you lined the two teams up against each other from this year versus last year, or this year versus 2 years ago. I don't know who would win or what that would look like, but generally speaking, this has been the most dominant conference run. And so I was thinking about it more from that perspective going into the asking of the question, just that it's been kind of a different sort of ride. But the way they all chose to frame it in their answers was really interesting too. Just the part where there's sort of a redemption vindication angle to it, just based on the fact that this team started out the way it did, and now that they felt a lot of the doubt externally. I know they say they try to block it out, but like Coach Traylor has said, it's just impossible to ignore all of that, or to at least not have it come on your radar at some point. And so certainly that, and there's times where they've admitted that they even put stuff up on the board and kind of said, look, this is what people were saying about you, and look where we are now. And so I think that element of vindication is very different from what we've seen the last couple of years, where the first year was just a surprise that nobody really saw coming for a program that hadn't been on that stage before. And then last season they had these huge expectations that they had earned because so much of the roster was coming back, and they lived up to them. But it was that's probably a different kind of feeling to
Yeah.
just repeat. And I think probably some of those dramatic finishes is what kept it interesting in different cases, or even like a game like UTEP where you fall behind 21-0 and you rally. And so I think that was certainly a different experience from this year, where the games have not had that drama, but they had to battle back from that September that they've talked about so many times, and when the way that impacted everybody. So they've been able to have kind of a fresh experience this year, even though it's the third time in a row they've been 6-0 to start the league season.
Yep, five of the six wins in the 6 game winning streak have been by double digits. So it is.
Do you how do you compare this year team to the last couple?
Well, it's hard. They're all different, right? The competition's a little different. You can't say the September didn't matter, because obviously if you have one less loss, the conversation you're having primarily is, are you the top group of five team with the New Year Six Bowl aspiration? So it's a little different though. That September kind of, I think, set them under the radar a little bit, and they've worked really hard to get themselves back into at least the conversation. I don't know how great of an argument they have to be the top G5 team. I don't imagine a 3-loss team would ever make it, but some could make that argument. And they're playing well, and they're still not probably playing as well as they could be. I think Frank Harris has another level. I don't know if we'll see him get to that this year, but the offense is just playing so well as the defense, and the special teams has been solid. So I think the only thing that could stop the Roadrunners now, 2 weeks out, is themselves. They're favorite this week against USF, and they're either going to be a close underdog against Tulane. And I mean, look at the way the last few weeks have played out in the AAC. Anything could happen. And what's your take? I know we were talking offline a little bit about how we think this AAC race is going to play out, but certainly three teams undefeated for the first place, and Memphis kind of lingering there at fourth place. Certainly a lot of things still to shake out these last 2 weeks, I think.
Yeah, Memphis could throw a wrench into it playing SMU this week and
Yeah,
being able to play that game in Memphis. But I do think that it does seem like it's going to come down to UTSA against Tulane, and the winner plays against SMU in the conference championship game. And it's nice for us. It's pretty simple and straightforward.
yeah,
And I think if UTSA beats Tulane and if they beat SMU, they'll have a great case to be the top group of five team. If for no other reason than that there's not an obvious other option. I mean, you couldn't take SMU or Tulane over them at that point. That would be
right.
ridiculous.
Yeah,
Like I don't even know if that's in the rules. I think you have to be the champion, right? So
yeah,
then you're looking at whoever is second to James Madison, because they're not going to be eligible, which is, that's not going to be a very appealing invite. And then I don't even know who it would be from those. It looked like Air Force for a while, but with them taking a loss, I don't. So even with 3 losses, if UTSA wins the AAC, I think that will feel like it'll feel like nationally like they belong there and deserve to be there. And I don't know if they'll be in the rankings just because they have those 3 losses already, but
right, right.
it would at least make sense that they would be that team at that point. And I think that it would be well earned.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what those computer rankings do. I don't know how and where they calculate. Obviously, we're not talking college football playoff rankings, but yeah, an important 2 weeks here for the Roadrunners. Greg, I think that'll wrap this one up unless you got anything else.
Now, you don't want to talk about Texas A&M?
Oh yes, let's talk about Texas
I don't
A&M.
know.
Big news. Big news out of College Station on Sunday morning. The Aggies have departed, have moved on, departed ways from Jimbo Fisher. A I guess a ground shaking movement in Texas here that's gonna they're gonna search for their next coach, and obviously UTSA head coach Jeff Traylor is one of the, I would say, handful of candidates that is attractive to them. Um, I don't know, Greg. What's your immediate reaction to seeing that?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways you can go with that. Obviously, I think the first reaction is the buyout number with
Right.
Jimbo. How I think
Yes.
it was close to 75 million, and then you're talking close to 100 million once you take care of the assistants and everything else. So from that point right there, you already know that the money part of it is not going to be a huge issue. So when you look at Jeff Traylor's candidacy right away, it's a $7 million buyout before the end of the year and a $6 million buyout after that. And I just think that that would be a non-factor. But I do believe that independent of whether you think Jeff Traylor would or wouldn't do a great job in that role, I believe it's probably a hard sell for the people paying $100 million to get this done, to bring in a coach who hasn't won a bowl game. He's been at
Right.
UTSA for 4 years, and maybe in a few weeks it looks a little bit more appealing if they beat Tulane and beat SMU, and then they get that spot in the New Year's Six, and suddenly he looks like a big name. But this is not the same level of success that a program like Cincinnati had before, or like Houston, when they were on their kind of run through the group of five, or even like a UCF, where
Right.
those coaches all kind of parlayed that into other jobs. And so I just don't know that this is that same level of success at this point. And I don't know that you pay $75 million plus to then hire anything but the sexiest of hires, right? Like a Dan Lanning,
Yeah.
or even somebody like Mike Elko, who's been there before. I personally feel like those are more likely, but that's me talking about it from somebody who reads online. Like any fan could have that same opinion. That's not like insider information or anything like that. So I it would be shocking if they didn't kick the tires on Jeff Traylor and just see what was there and consider that an option. But I think that that's probably a harder sell for their fan base and for their supporters and for the donor group than somebody like one of those big sexy names.
Yeah, and that's not to say Jeff Traylor wouldn't be good there, because that, I think he could be great there, but you're right. I mean, they are gonna go after a big splash name, and I don't know that Jeff Traylor checks that box, but who knows? There are
Maybe
certain,
they want to do something different. I mean, what
yeah,
was splashier than hiring Jimbo, a national
right,
championship winning
and it didn't
coach?
work out.
And
Yeah,
it's hard to go from here's the guy who won a national championship to here's the guy who won 3 state titles at Gilmer. Like, I understand that some people might not react well to that. And I think it's pretty obvious to say at this point that Jeff Traylor's a good football coach, but I do think we should acknowledge that A&M would be a totally different challenge, right? Um, there's certain stuff he gets away with here, like little comments, and even I think like when he gets sarcastic or makes some jokes or whatever. And I just think people are going to be way more hyper focused on that stuff. And if he thinks he faces scrutiny for that here, it's going to be so much worse on such a national stage. And he's just he's always come across, very relatable, very integrated in the community, and has been able to drum up a lot of support and a lot of belief in the program because of that. And those are just not qualities that I think work the same way or are needed the same way or play the same way at a program like A&M. And who even knows if the 5-star recruits of the world are interested in the triangle of toughness and all of these things that we kind of shrugged at or rolled our eyes at when he first got here, that ended up being the foundation of this really successful culture. I just don't know if that's something that today's athletes necessarily want to buy into when they're at that elite level to get recruited to a program at A&M. So it would be just as much of an unknown in that sense as it was when he started here. And obviously here worked out quite well. So there's no saying he wouldn't be hugely successful at A&M. I just think that it's not a guarantee necessarily. So not only is it not going to win the press release where you're not going to get people super excited about that, but it's also not like it's this guarantee that they're going to be right back on track. I think there would be a lot for him to prove that he hasn't done before as well. So those are just a couple reasons I sort of don't see it, but I also wouldn't be completely floored if it did end up going that way. I'm sure that they will investigate and talk to him, and we'll see how it goes.
yep. I think other potential job openings would be something to watch as well. To see if there's any other openings in Texas or surrounding places, Houston, Baylor, Arkansas, just some of those. I'd be as concerned from a UTSA standpoint about those schools as you would a Texas A&M, just because all of those places also do have the resources. I mean, Texas A&M has every resource you need to be able to be successful. So who knows? Who knows how it plays out here in the next month or so, right?
Yeah, we'll see how many of those jobs come open. I don't know. It seems like all of those are kind of up in the air, but I mean, it seemed as recently as last week like Jimbo was going to be probably safe. So it just sort of is very hard to know precisely how it's going to play out. And so I do think the farther you go down the list, the more that $7 million buyout figure might become a deterrent.
Yeah,
I mean, I think all those programs you mentioned can come up with it, but it's certainly not, they're not going to be happy about it. You know what I mean? I
right,
think
right.
it might be a little bit of something that pushes them to at least consider other options or not consider it as much of a slam dunk as it might have been before he signed that contract extension that put him in the situation where it is so expensive for him to move on from UTSA.
And that's a good thing for the Roadrunners on both sides of the argument
Right.
there, because I mean,
Well,
you get the
yeah, I think
money
that
if
was
he
the
goes. Yeah,
that was the idea, right? Like, because you talk about there's already a little bit of an effort of a conversation out there, just on Twitter or whatever. But people like, well, what can UTSA do? How can they sort of rally support, or what kind of donations could come in, or what could make this an enticing place for Trailer to stay? And if talking about Texas A&M, nothing you could
nothing.
do
Yeah,
would
yeah.
ever get to that level. But if you're talking about Houston or Baylor or yeah, I don't know who else would be in the mix, but that level of school,
Yeah,
then maybe
yeah,
at that point there's enough that could happen here where this would feel just as appealing or not worth making that jump, and he could continue to try to have success here until that opportunity at a Texas or an A&M comes together. But when you have an opportunity to jump to a place with that level of resources, you kind of have to take it. I would think so. If that offer comes through, there's no part of Jeff Traylor that's going to turn it. I can't imagine that. That would be like not just financially, but just the resources that you have available to you,
the
and especially
opportunity,
when
the opportunity
there's
as
just
a
no
coach to go in there and try and really prove your mettle. I think that's more than the money. I think.
right. And the trajectory of this program has been fine, right? But like when you talk about the student athletics fee or the inability to get the practice facility built,
Yeah,
it's just not a perfect scenario where at these other places you have
recruiting
everything that you need.
budget, staff.
Right. So from that, again, you might find that compared to Houston and Baylor, you're still UTSA and what's been built here and the connections he's made is still more appealing. But compared to a place like Texas A&M, where you could compete for a national championship based on the resources that they have, that's an impossible thing to say no to. So anybody hoping that he's going to get the offer and turn it down is probably out of line. But if it comes down to a lower level school that's making that offer, maybe you can keep that hope alive.
Right. Yep. And I don't know that we may have seen some of that in the past few years and just not really known about it for certain. So, well, Greg, I think that'll wrap up this week unless you got anything else.
No, the last note on that would be I would expect to see a rumor, whether it's true or not, because it'll help get some money flowing around here.
Yep.
So
Yep.
don't be shocked when the name gets connected.
Yep. Sounds great. Well, Greg, that'll wrap it up. Back in the Alamo Dome Friday night for a primetime game against South Florida. And week 12, UTSA improves their record to 7-3 with a 6-game winning streak in AAC play. JJ Perez for Inside Runner Sports, Greg Lucas, San Antonio Express News. Thanks for watching, everyone.